Welcome back into the new year. I hope you have had a good Christmas, and I'd like to say that you had opportunity to revise at least once, maybe last week, what we've been covering in the last semester, so that as we go on, as they say, the train never stops. I have to tell you that this is the first time that I've taught this course online. Using Mounce's material. I've used different kinds of material in the past, John Wenham's grammar book and Duff's grammar book that's based upon that. But Mounce is new material for me from that standpoint. And so it's interesting to see how Mounce makes things so easily understandable in many respects by giving us the professor and different concepts in respect to how we can understand it. Having said that, though, we still have to use basic memorization techniques, and I'm experimenting with this, I have to tell you, because one of my friends who's doing a Master of Divinity online with Western Seminary, he told me that the Western Seminary people did the whole of Mounce in one semester. In other words, they were doing 3 chapters per week, which I found unconscionable, let alone extremely difficult from that standpoint. So in fact, when I asked him when he finished it, I asked him whether he actually remembered anything, because everything was based upon short-term memory from that standpoint. And he said it was basically a blur and just getting through the course. So what I'm doing is, when I first started, I'll give you the rationale for it. I thought to myself, well, we'll start off on 1. By that, I'm talking about 1 chapter a week, because I wasn't sure to what degree you were taking other courses too, because you need to obviously spend a lot of time doing this, and if you're taking full courses and at the same time you're involved in doing a ministry somewhere, that is a massive undertaking. When I was studying Greek way back, I could do 3 sessions a week because I was full-time. But having said that, we didn't. We did 2 sessions a week. In other words, we'd have done 2 chapters per week, 1 every 3 or 4 days. In this situation, what I've done is I've looked at it and watched your comments and said to myself, well, if I find that after a term that it's easy to do 1 chapter a week, then what we could do is we could double up and do 2 chapters in the second semester and then do a translation of 1 John. Now, that was what was in my mind. At this point, because for what I've heard from you, it's basically we stick to the same format that we've got. And then I'll be negotiating, I'm hoping, with the authorities that be, that we could do some kind of exegesis after that, so that we can get some benefit from all this terror of memorization, etc., of what we have to do. Having said that then, well, I hope you at least had an opportunity once to go through the material that we've covered in the last semester, because here we are again, and we've hit the ground running. And I just want to make just a simple point from the material you've got. And that is the notion of what I started in the first couple of weeks, and I mentioned about being a detective. One of the great things that will occur eventually when we've done the 36 chapters, we've mastered most of this material. As I said to you, even if you absorb about 50 to 60% of it, what will happen is when you're doing translation, another 20% will come back to you as you look at things and go over them and repeat what you've learned and then forgotten and so on. And then after a while in doing it, you find that you've really mastered a good 75 to 80%. So where does that come from? What it comes from, in a way, to me, is the fact that at the end of the day, by that, it's at the beginning of the day, whatever it is you do, you Greek, what you find is that you have before you the material. So in other words, you are a detective. That's what I'm saying. And so that, for example, on page 158 in Mounce's book, in chapter 19, what do you see? You see basically the 7 tenses of agapo that we have to learn. And these are basically the principal parts of verbs, and we're being introduced there. And you know the present tense, so you've done that. And what we're doing today is the future tense. And then what he's done, which I think is helpful, I hope I can build on that, and it's not too complicated because he's given you lots of other tenses there, the other tenses that we don't know yet. I just want to give you just a peek to say what's going on here in terms of how you crack open these verbs, and of course nouns too, but primarily verbs, because one of the main things, obviously, when you're in a sentence, as you really start to become familiar with this material, is that you're looking for the main verb. You're looking for the main clause in a sentence, and then when you found the main verb, then you can work out the subordinate clauses, participle clauses, and so forth, relative clauses, and etc., etc. But you're looking for the main verb, and the main verb then is going to be something that you really want to become familiar with, and you become familiar with it not so much by knowing every single regular, yes, and irregular, not necessarily, in my view, but you learn what you can in respect to it and what interests you, and so forth. But what you learn is you learn how to be detective to crack open the verb. That's my point. So that, for example, you see the tenses that Mounce mentions there: present tense, perfect tense, action in the future, imperfect tense, action in the past, usually continual action in the past, aorist tense, again, in a general way I'm talking about, because it would depend upon the context how you translate it, but I would say point in time in the past. I'd begin from there, from that standpoint. Aorist active, so then point in time in the past, but active. In other words, the subject is doing the action, or has done the action in this case. I loved. Perfect active, something that's occurred in the past and the effect's been felt in the present. That's how I begin to understand it. You have to have some sort of notion on how you'll translate these tenses, and then you look at the context to see whether what you're saying is whether it fits or not, etc. Perfect passive, in other words, passive meaning that the action is done on the person, on the subject. In other words, I have been loved. And then finally the aorist passive, which again is past tense, and the notion of a point that happened tense, I was loved. Or it could again, I have been loved, point in time. That's how I'm differentiating between the passive, the perfect and the aorist and the past. Usually the perfect, I don't want to get too far into it because the perfect has other notions too in terms of activity in the past that actually relates to what's going on in the present, but we'll get to that. So at this point, all I just want to basically say is you look at the verbs, the 7 principal parts there that are put down, and you can see from the tense stem, agapat, then you look, well, you know the present, so in other words, o, ese, omen, ete, use, and so on, so you've got that. All right. Now, what's been added to it in the future tense, as we looked, as he says, is a sigma. So one of the first things then you're looking at when you look at a verb, whether you recognize it or not, is you're looking at the what I'd call the ending, so to speak. You've got to be careful about ending there, because is it the ending as it relates to the actual ending that's tacked on to the stem of the verb, or is it actually the ending of the stem? Well, we won't get into that at this point, but just say you're looking for it. And when you see a sigma, then that could tell you that this is a future tense. So in other words then, you know this. In a very simple form, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with regular verbs, and when you see a sigma that's attached at the end of the stem, luo, luso, you know that it's future. And the good news is that the endings of the future are exactly the same as the endings of the present. So really you're just looking at a sigma from that standpoint. So that's going to help you with the future tense. Now, I'm going to go through just very quickly. I don't want to scare you because you've not done these tenses yet. And you can, if it's too much for you, you can forget it now. But there's a sense, by forget it, I mean not go on with what I'm doing now and just go back to just learning off this stuff for this week. But just to give you just some idea, is, well, first of all, that's true with luo as a regular verb, but agapo is actually what? It's what I call an ao verb. In other words, the stem ends in alpha. So what's going to happen is then that the first person indicative active is going to be the verb end, the verbal ending of the stem there. The alpha will drop out, so it will be agapo. All right. So, but in the future then, it's going to be lengthened, as Mounce mentioned. So in other words, that's another indication then. When you see an eta, you're going to be thinking, is it an ao or an eo verb there? If you see an omega, you think, oh, well, it could be an omicron, and so forth. So from that standpoint, there's two notions straight away that you should start to become just a bit familiar with. You learn the endings off. You know that the future is just like the present. and the sigma is then added to the present stem. And in the case of an ao verb, and in what I call an eo verb, nikeo, for example, poieo, then the future has the stem lengthened from an epsilon, in this case an alpha, into an eta. So it's the eta and the sigma that is really important, because that's going to tell something to you. And when you look at the beginning, you see the verb as it is. It's untouched, so to speak. Now, by untouched, I mean, if you go back and you look at the second one, because I've just done the third principal parts, the second one is the imperfect, which we've not done. But I want you to notice how, again, that beginning of the verbal stem, the alpha, is lengthened to an eta. When you see that eta, that's going to tell you, it's called I call it it's an augment. In other words, it's added to it and it tells you it's action in the past. That's important, because then when you see that on regular verb, then you recognize, we've got an action in the past now, but you notice the ending there. The ending is own, which is an ending you don't know yet. Don't worry about that. It's an imperfect ending. But look at the next one, aorist, which is also in the past, and it's active, and it's also got that augment on it, you see. But notice as well, here's the good news, just to give you the development of this, the aorist endings are going to keep the sigma on the future. In other words, let's put it that way. In other words, they'll add to the sigma will be present in the aorist ending as it's in the future ending, although the endings will be slightly different. So all I'm saying there is, okay, so what have you learned there? Is that the eta is an augment that will tell you it's in the past, and then that's true. You look at perfect active, same thing. Except if you notice that, and I'm just basically looking at Mount's page 158, is that then when you see the perfect active, which is, again, in the past, what you have is the alpha that's lengthened to an eta, but also you notice that instead of a sigma, which you had with aorist active, you've got a kappa. So when you see that kappa, and this is all in conjunction too with the eta that's there because of the lengthening of the end of the vowel stem, the kappa is going to tell you it's perfect. Those are little clues along the way. Now, and then you've got a perfect passive. You've got the same thing in the sense that, well, you've got an ending that's completely different. That's okay. There's no kappa that's there. It's passive. But you do have the augment that's there. And then the last one, again, augment in the past because it's aorist passive. And you have this time this theta. Look at that theta thing. That will tell you. That's the way to lock these things, to unlock these things in respect to as you look at the 7 principal parts, the forms of the verb as you go forward. So then you get in your mind just a rough idea of translation. In other words, it's present, simple present, or continuous present. I love, I am loving. Future, I will love. That's definite. It's going to, when we get into what's called the subjunctive tense, we're going to see the sense of maybe, sense of doubt, of could be, may I, etc. This is definite. I will do this. All right. And then when it comes to imperfect, I loved, I was loved, could be continuous, could be a point in time, depends upon the context. I usually always begin with it being a sort of an action that's occurred in the past, and then differentiate between the aorist, which is point in time. That's where I begin, and then perfect. I have loved. Action in the past that's continuing into the present. Perfect passive, same thing the other way around though. I have been loved. Let's think of it in sense of active tense. Is the inflection is what? Is the idea of that I'm doing the action as opposed to passive. The action's been done to me. I have been loved. And likewise with the aorist passive. With the aorist passive, which is I was loved. Or well. I hope that helps at this point as we move forward. I'm always available for a phone call or for a, you know this anyway because you've all contacted me in different ways, or else just from a standpoint of a text or an email to help in a situation. I know you've got a lot to cover. I just encourage you to get into it straight away, if you can this weekend, as well as going through this. It's not too much in chapter 19 for here. And the vocabulary is fairly straightforward anyway, and I won't go through the vocabulary because there's a lot of those words, basileus, king, and so forth, that you can work out very easy from what we know already. So see if you can go over just things, just even do a revision as well as chapter 19, so that we hit the ground next week on Monday, hitting chapter 20. And the good news is, of course, we're past the halfway stage. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.